Yeah, hi everybody. I do a bit of speaking at business schools and universities, and for some reason every time I enter a university or business school I get this feeling of having a bad conscience. Because I've also been a student, and maybe it was because I wasn't among the most frequent visitors at the study hall. So it's all coming back to me, all the stuff I hadn't done, all the stuff I hadn't read, and these exams coming up. And so I hope you guys are kind of better students than what I was many years ago. Anyway, my name is Bjarte Bogsnes. I work for a company called Statoil. I'll come back to the company in a minute. When I studied finance, as I guess most of you are doing as well. But I've also spent some years working within human resources. I've been heading up a human resources function for some years, which is actually relevant for what I will talk about today. I've also been in different leadership roles for more than 20 years, which is also relevant for what I will talk about today. Because actually this topic is about more than budgets. Beyond budgeting is actually quite a misleading name, because this is about challenging the traditional ways of leading and managing in companies. And in doing that, we also need to challenge the traditional budget, because that sits at the core of traditional management. So that's where the name is coming from. What I would like to share with you today is first a little bit about what do we see as the problems with what we've chosen to call traditional management, which is actually the way that most companies are managed still today. I'm going to make things a bit black and white, maybe be a bit blunt and not too nice with traditional management and traditional budgeting, but I do it in a way with a very good, I do it to get a few points across, but I do it also with a good conscience, because my first management job back in Statoil in 1984 was head of the corporate budget department. I've been heading up more budget processes, not just in that job, but in many later finance manager jobs, than I want to be reminded about. I've done a lot of stupid things in my life, looking back. But I think it also gives me a kind of platform to be quite critical, because I've been there, I've done that, I've been on the inside of these processes for many years. But I'd like to start with the case for change. What kind of problems are we trying to solve? Then I've got a few slides on beyond budgeting. Again, it is somewhat of a misleading name, because it is bigger than only budgets, but we also shall talk about budgets, absolutely. Then I'm going to zoom into Statoil, the company I work in, and we're going to talk about our model, which is inspired by beyond budgeting. We call it ambition to action, which is actually a kind of hybrid between the balanced scorecard and beyond budgeting. And everything I'm going to talk about here are things that we decided to do back in Statoil in 2005. But decided doesn't mean that all of this yet have reached every corner and every head of Statoil, because these are big changes. It takes time, it should take time. This is not a quick fix. Everything is decided and we are well underway, but this is more of a journey than a quick fix. But having taken these decisions back in 2005 and having started implementing, our appetite for doing even more were growing. So in 2010, we made a new decision, which we would not have been ready for back in 2005 when we kicked out the budget. In 2010, we decided to also kick out the calendar year wherever possible. Because from a business point of view, January to December is very often an artificial construct, an artificial period. Not from an accounting point of view, not from a tax point of view, but from a business point of view. For some, it's too short, for some, it's too long. So that was another traditional way of doing things that we wanted to challenge. And I'd like to finish off with sharing that part of the story with you as well. And feel free to ask questions as we go along. It could be that some of your questions is about stuff that I will come to later on. For instance, if you have questions about how do we manage cost without a traditional budget, well, I'm coming to it, but that's not where I'm starting, because this is about so much more than only cost management. Statoil, I'm going to make the commercial very short here, but just a few slides. We are a Norwegian energy company. We're into oil, gas, and renewable energy. We have, amongst other things, offshore wind power, windmills in the UK. But oil and gas is our main business. A turnover in the range of between 70 and 100 billion US dollars, depending on the oil price. 20,000 employees in, well, today I guess it's 36 countries. And we are listed in, we are a public company listed in New York and Oslo, but the Norwegian state still has a majority shareholding. The Norwegian continental shelf is quite mature. So if we want to grow, it has to take place outside of Norway. So there's a lot of activity going on outside of Norway. But we have actually just made some very encouraging discoveries on the Norwegian continental shelf last year. But we also made a lot of encouraging discoveries outside of Norway. Actually, 15% of all oil and gas found in the world last year was found by Statoil. So we did pretty well on new discoveries. Here is a slide here is some more information about us. This is Fortune 500, you know, which ranks companies on all kind of metrics. And on social responsibility, we came out as number 1, which made us quite proud. But on innovation, we came out as number 7, which is also pretty good if you look at which other companies are on that list. And of course, for us, innovation is very much about technology, because we are a very technology-oriented company. But maybe there is a piece of management innovation also in here. We don't know, because we are not exactly sure what we were judged on. But that is what I will talk about today, management innovation. I've got one more league table for you. This is, and now we are into some financial performance numbers. And the key message here is not how we have performed or what kind of metrics we use, but how we define performance. The two metrics you see here, shareholder return and return on capital, are not unique metrics in any way. A number of other companies use those, and they have their weaknesses as KPIs or metrics. But the key message here is that we define performance in relative and not absolute terms. On return on capital employed, as an example, we no longer set the target of, say, for instance, 12.5% return. We used to do that. And I recall one year we had such a target and we delivered 12.9% return. Target 12.5, actual performance 12.9. Is that good or bad? Was that good or bad performance? It depends, right? Absolutely 12.9 is higher than 12.5, but it's not very impressive with 12.9 if all the other guys that we are competing with, which you see on this list, deliver 13, 14 or 15, or vice versa. So this is how we now set our targets. We want to be in the first quartile on the right-hand KPI here, and above average on the one on the left-hand side. And these are actually this is the closest our board comes to approve a budget. They do not approve a traditional budget. These are the metrics, these are the targets they approve when it comes to financial performance. They do approve some other things as well. And by the way, these two metrics are the key metrics in the common bonus scheme we have in Statoil. A common bonus scheme with everybody on board, us against the competition, everybody in the same boat. I'll come back to bonuses a bit later on, because that's also part of the story. Here, I've actually introduced the key word in this presentation, namely performance. Because we must never forget that all the stuff we do as finance people, or as HR people, or as other people in companies, all the stuff we do has only one purpose, and that is to help our companies to perform to their full potential. That is the only purpose. Very often, we finance people and others, we tend to become a bit myopic, a bit kind of very focused on the stuff we are doing, kind of implementing these perfect processes, perfect balance scorecards and activity-based costing and all the stuff we do. But the only purpose of all that is to help our companies to perform to the full potential. We must never forget that. So I would like us to reflect a bit on performance in a different setting than business and companies for a minute. I would like us to move into traffic. Does anybody have a car? Okay, some of you. Were some of you driving to the university this morning? Okay, some of you. Right. When we are out in traffic driving, we would also like to see good performance, especially in all these traffic crossings that we are meeting. So what is good performance in traffic? What would we like to see in traffic? No accidents. Absolutely. Safety should come first. Perfect. So we want it to be safe and maybe something more. Sorry? Cautious.
Yes. Giving way.
Yeah. Okay. Absolutely. And I'm coming back to that because those are quite important things. But we want a good traffic flow, right? So a safe and efficient flow is what you could call good performance in traffic. Now, there are different ways of achieving that, and the traffic authorities are actually managing performance in order to achieve that. They are managing us as kind of drivers in traffic. So what kind of ways do the traffic authorities have? What kind of mechanisms? Traffic lights. That's one possibility, right? The traffic light. Let's have a look at the traffic light. And let's ask two questions around the traffic light. Who is actually managing? Who is in control in the traffic light? As you are sitting there waiting for the green light.
Depends on the system.
Well, don't stretch the metaphor here. This is the good old-fashioned traffic light. No sensors, no nothing. Right? It's been programmed. Right? It's been programmed. So who is actually managing? Who is in control?
The designer.
Yeah, the designer. Those who programmed this traffic light, right? And by the way, where are those guys sitting while you are sitting there waiting for the green light? They are not sitting inside that pole, right? They are in an office somewhere for good natural reasons. They are not in this situation. And based on which information did these guys base their programming? What kind of historical data? Probably looking at historical traffic patterns and then maybe making some assumptions about the future and what it might look like. Right? Probably doing a good job as possible. But for natural reasons, that cannot be entirely fresh information, again, as you're sitting there waiting. So that's one way of managing traffic. Are there alternatives to the traffic light?
Roundabout.
The roundabout, absolutely. Let's have a look at the roundabout. And let's ask the same questions around the roundabout. Who is in control? Who is managing in the roundabout? Traffic itself. People in traffic. Us being in the situation. And based on which information?
Science and the rules of traveling.
Science?
Decides who is going first and who has to wait for the roundabout.
Yeah. That's right. You're talking about the principle of a roundabout. Yeah. But the information we are, in a way, I agree, but the information we are basing us on.
What's happening in the present situation?
What is happening in the present, the situation here and now? Which other cars are there, incoming cars, and what's the traffic pattern, right? So quite different answers to the two same questions, right? About who is actually managing, who is in control, and based on which information. So let's then compare these two ways of managing, since we get so different answers. Which one of these two is normally most efficient? Normally. The roundabout. Thank you. I agree, absolutely. Normally, the roundabout. Why is that, by the way? Why is the roundabout more efficient? Because
we are responsible for our decisions and we have absolute control of our next move.
right, absolutely. Here, I mean, in the roundabout, people have the authority to make the right decisions in that situation based on real-time information, what they see here and now, right? Maybe that is the reason why this normally is more efficient.
We can also don't stop on the red light.
Maybe that could be a fallback, but let's not complicate this. Let's keep it simple. You might also ask, I mean, what about the alternative of the police officer standing in that traffic crossing on a box, right? And waving and shouting and whistling. Well, that's also an alternative way of managing. But I would argue that who needs that middle manager when the roundabout can do the job much cheaper and much better? Another question, which of these two models are most difficult to operate as a driver? Which is more difficult to be in? The roundabout, absolutely. And that is a lesson for the stuff we will talk about afterwards, that the good stuff, the most efficient stuff in companies are often more difficult. But we shouldn't shy away from it simply because it is more difficult. We should aim for what is good, what is efficient, even if that very often is more difficult. Everything I will talk about today is more difficult than the stuff we are trying to leave. But it is better. One more question here. Is it relevant to talk about values in this setting? I heard you mention a value. What you said? What was your?
Well, certainly values are important, particularly both your own and those of the other drivers.
Yeah. When we talk about values-based management, it's an expression you often use. What's the opposite of values-based management? Sorry? Analytical. Unethical. Okay, right. Unethical. Yeah, absolutely. I was on a slightly different scale of values-based versus rules-based. Right? We often talk about rules-based management, values-based management. The traffic light, that is just one big rule, right? And very simple. Red is stop, green is drive, and then we can discuss yellow. There seems to be a few different interpretations, but a very simple system, right? And if the key value among people waiting for the green light is me first, and I don't care about the rest, that is not a problem in a traffic light, because you are overruled by the green light, by the red light. But it is a problem if that is a key value in the roundabout, because in the roundabout we are more dependent of people being in that situation, having a common wish of wanting this to flow well. We are more dependent on others. We need to be more considerate, right? We need to try to interpret the intentions of others. We have to make our own intentions visible. That system is much more dependent on a strong positive value set among those in traffic. And that is also relevant for what we will talk about later on. What you see on the right-hand side here is a much more self-regulating system that kind of regulates itself, is less dependent on rules compared to the traffic light. And coming back to business now, leaving traffic, I would argue that in today's business realities, we need more self-regulating systems for two reasons. There are two triggers for why we need this. The first one is an external one, and it has to do with the world out there. Our business environment, which is turbulent, dynamic, unpredictable, much more dynamic than when I started my budgeting career back in 1984. The uncertainty around the oil price as one example there, at that time, we thought that an uncertainty span of plus minus $2 was a huge uncertainty span. Today, that's the variation you can have within a day, as one example. But there are so many other uncertainties. Who knows what lies around the next corner for the world economy? Nobody, right? A lot of uncertainty. That uncertainty, that dynamics, must have implications for how we lead and manage. We need more self-regulating systems. So that is one trigger. The other trigger is not external, but it's actually internal, and is of a slightly different nature, and not slightly different, quite a different nature. It has to do with people, and it has to do with what kind of people we believe we have in the organization. And there are many ways and many languages you can use to talk about what kind of people you have in the organization. We have chosen to go back to someone called Douglas McGregor. He wrote a book back in 1960 called The Human Side of Enterprise, a fantastic book, and unfortunately, in a way, still relevant today. He introduced something called Theory X and Theory Y. Has anybody heard about Theory X and Theory Y? It's a long time ago. Nothing to do with Generation X and Y, that came later on.
In your paper, yes.
Sorry?
In your paper, yes.
Yeah, right, okay. So Theory X, that's a negative view on people. That's a view that most people in an organization is a bunch of potential thieves and crooks, which all must be managed tightly and kept on short leashes, because if not, we know what will happen. They will all run away and do a lot of stupid things and spend money like drunken sailors. Right. That's the popular version of Theory X. I think McGregor was a bit more academic in his words, but that was the popular version. Then we have Theory Y. Theory Y, very much the opposite. A much more positive view on people. A view that most people in an organization, beyond being highly well educated and very competent, are actually mature, responsible people who want to do a good job, who want to be involved, who want to contribute, who want to be taken seriously, who want to be treated as adults. And it's quite important that we ask ourselves, where do we think we have most of our people in the organization? Because that also has significant implications on how we lead and manage. If we think that most of our people is in the Theory X camp, the last thing I would have done was to leave the very detailed travel budgets, because then travel costs would explode. But if we believe that most people are in the other camp, then it is maybe not that dangerous not to have those detailed travel budgets, because this is something people can sort out for themselves. If we combine these two triggers, the world out there, people in the organization, then it might look like this. Business environment and people. And I would argue that traditional management, and again I will come back to how I define traditional management. I would argue that it seems like it has the assumption that the world is still a quiet, stable and plannable place, and most people is still in the Theory X camp. And there might have been a time when this was correct. But we think, even independent of whether there was a time it was correct or not, we think that for most companies, those days are behind us. We need to get up in that upper right-hand corner because things have changed. A little bit more about X and Y here before we continue, because this is not a question of either or, right? Every time I talk about this, I see some faces flashing in front of my eyes. People in Statoil that I know, which I actually would put on the left-hand side. I think you need to keep a close eye on them. They exist in Statoil and in every other organization. But that's not the issue. The issue, do they constitute a minority or a majority? Because we cannot let the minority drive the design of our performance management processes. Then we need to start with our majority view, and then we need to find other ways of dealing with these guys. It's just like in a free society, we are not putting everybody in jail because somebody someday will do something wrong, right? We are free citizens. But of course there are boundaries. If those are crossed, it should have consequences. Traditional management, what I mean. That is something that is very rigid, it's very detailed, it's very annual. Centralized, rules-based, a lot of command and control, a lot of secrecy, and a strong belief in sticks and carrots as the way to motivate and drive performance. We need to get up in that upper right-hand corner, and then we need to address both leadership and our management processes. On the leadership side, we need to be more values-based than rules-based. That doesn't mean no rules, but it means that the stronger we can be on the value side, the more elegant, the more robust they can do the job than a million rules can do for you. We need more autonomy. We need to create more autonomy for these teams to respond fast when decisions are required because the unexpected is happening. We need more transparency for many reasons. Here are two of them. We need transparency, of course, because how can we learn from each other if everything is secret? That is one obvious reason. But there is another reason. Some people are afraid of leaving traditional management because they are afraid of losing control. But transparency is actually a fantastic control system. I talked about these travel budgets and travel costs. There are actually companies out there. They have no travel budgets, hardly any travel rules beyond that at all. But what they have is full transparency. Everybody can see everything. Did you travel? And if you did travel, where did you travel? And did you fly, sleep, and eat cheap or expensive? Trust me, when everybody can see everything, it does something with your own behavior. There is a reason why thieves and crooks operate at night, because then there is no transparency, right? And finally, we need to get hold of that internal motivation in knowledge workers, if you can use that expression, that can move mountains if you get hold of it, but that we very often only scratch on the surface with the sticks and carrots. And if we had much longer time, we could have had a discussion about does individual bonuses fall into on the left-hand side or on the right-hand side here. I would classify individual bonuses as falling in the sticks and carrots camp and not reaching that internal motivation. But that's a separate discussion because it's a big, big topic. But I have already, I guess, revealed that I have lost my faith in individual bonuses. But it's not enough to do things on the leadership side. We also need to do stuff on the process side. And actually, in many companies, the stuff written on the right-hand side here is stuff that companies actually would subscribe to. Company would say that this is what we believe in. We want to be a people-focused, values-based organization. A lot of companies have different places where they write down stuff. We have something called the Statoil book, and here we talk about our values and our people principles. And we have always been a very people-oriented, values-oriented company since we started out in Statoil in the early 70s. So our problem was that we had management processes which had a different message, right? It doesn't help to say anything, say nice things about people in books like this if what people experience in the management processes is a very different message. Those gaps between what is said and done in companies are actually poison. Let me give you an example. A good friend of mine, he's a pilot, and not just a pilot, he's even a captain with Scandinavian Airlines. So from a trust and responsibility point of view, he is pretty well off, right? Think about the responsibility he has been given every day for a lot of people's lives, and some quite expensive planes on top of that, right? So far, so good. But if my friend if my friend Knut, if he wants to change his uniform shirt more frequently than what is stated in the uniform policy of Scandinavian Airlines, guess what? He needs a written approval from the level above. And then I wonder, how deep and sincere is really that trust shown to him? Or could it be that the corporate management of Scandinavian Airlines, SAS, that they have no choice because they can probably not fly those planes? But we can all have a view on shirt cleaning and travel cost and all this smaller stuff that we all understand. And it's very often in companies that it's on the small stuff kind of in other people's view is kind of seeping through. And I'm not saying this to be critical to SAS. I think actually it's quite a great company. You can find these discrepancies between what is said and done in any company, even in Statoil. But those are the gaps we need to close because our words become hollow if our management processes have a different message. But it's not enough to address the leadership side. We also need to address the process side. And there's a lot of stuff we need to do on the process side. I'm going to share with you some things that we need to do. We need, when it comes to setting goals and targets, for instance, we need to think differently. We need to have less of what I often call 29.2 targets, right? Where the target is 29.2, everything above is good, anything below is bad, end of story. In these kind of business realities, that is not an intelligent enough way of defining performance. There has to be space and room for something more. First of all, we need to think more in relative terms than absolute terms, right? Like we did with Statoil and the relative targets I was showing. But there also has to be room for more than measurement. There has to be room for hindsight insights, looking at things that have changed, management assessment, common sense, combining that with measurement before we conclude. We call this a holistic performance evaluation. And we also need, as another example, we need more dynamics into the way we plan, forecast, set targets, allocate resources. We have to do this on a rhythm, or rather rhythms, that reflects the big variety of rhythms very often found in companies. And not force everything to circulate around the calendar year if that is an artificial period. And this is what Beyond Budgeting is about. Trying to get up in that right-hand corner by addressing both leadership and processes. And in doing that, you need to not just change the budgeting process, you need also to change the budgeting mindset. It is as simple and as difficult as that. We are not alone in Statoil in trying to move up in that right-hand corner. And I'm saying trying because it is hard. It is very hard. A number of other companies is on a similar journey. And here are some of them. There's a lot of exciting stuff happening in Norway these days. So there's some Norwegian companies on the left-hand side which you wouldn't know. But actually, some of them are quite big. Telenor is, I think, is the 7th largest telecommunications company in the world. Pretty big. Some of these others are quite big as well. In the middle here, some other European, Scandinavian cases. And on the right-hand side, some US cases. Also a very exciting case from this company, TM, Telecom Malaysia. Has a very exciting beyond budgeting concept running. But the veteran here is the company you find on top, up here. This bank is a Swedish bank called Handelsbanken, Commerzbank, that would be in English, I guess. This bank completely abandoned traditional budgets back in 1970 already. Not because it was a goal in itself, but it was a natural consequence of trying to move up in that right-hand corner. And this bank has been sticking to the same way of managing ever since, just deepening, broadening the model, getting better and better on it, and operating in a radically different way than its competitors. It is a Swedish bank, but they are actually quite big in the UK as well. I think they have around 100 branches here or something. But since this bank has been kind of sticking to the same model for so long, it becomes relevant to ask the question we should ask, namely, does this work? Is this good for performance? Because again, that's the only reason we should do this. If it is not good for performance, we probably shouldn't do it, right? Well, this bank has been performing better than the average of its competitors every single year since 1972. This bank has never needed a bailout. This bank has customer satisfaction ratings up here compared to the other banks. And on the cost side, where we might have some concerns, this bank is among the most, or probably the most cost-effective universal bank in Europe, without traditional cost budgets. If we have time later on, I'll talk a bit about more what they are doing. What is so fascinating with their model is all the stuff they are not doing. They hardly set targets. They hardly plan. They simply perform extremely well, but it is a very decentralized model with a lot of local autonomy for local branch managers to make the right decisions because they are based on actual information that they have here and now. What I find fascinating with what has happened with these companies and many others is that when this took off in the started to take off, let me put it like that, in the mid-90s, because Handelsbanken was a pioneer very early, but it was in the mid-90s that stuff started to happen. I worked in a company called Borealis at that time. We kicked out the budget in 1995. They are not on the list now because they have had a complete change of owners and management and have taken a few steps back. But when we kicked out the budget in Borealis in 1995, we hadn't heard about any other company doing this before us. Of course they existed. We were based in Copenhagen at the time and we had Handelsbanken in Sweden, but this was before the internet and Google and searching, right? So it was a bit more difficult to find out what was going on. Of course we found out about these guys afterwards. So when it happened in Borealis and in these other companies, this was more of a grassroots rebellion from people in companies rebelling against the stupidity of the old way of doing things because people saw that it didn't work. So this did not come from the consulting business. It was not McKinsey, Accenture, Ernst & Young kind of pushing this as the new management thing. At that time they were completely absent. Now they are very interested, and that's good. But at that time, completely absent. And sorry guys, it was not coming from academia either. Now academia is very interested. I'm here talking about it, right? At that time, they were very absent. The biggest business school in Norway, the biggest research project they have right now is about beyond budgeting. Very interested, and that's great. But at that time, a grassroots rebellion from people in the front line. Then there were two English guys who got interested. They saw that something is happening here. They interviewed many companies and they found a number of similarities between what these companies were doing and what they were rebelling against. Of course it wasn't similar because this was not coordinated, right? There were no books written, no nothing. But it was similar enough for these two guys, Jeremy Hope and Robin Fraser, both from the UK. It was similar enough for these two to describe what they saw through 12 principles. And they also came up with the name Beyond Budgeting, right or wrong. It is a bit misleading because I hope you have understood by now that this is much, much broader. And I'm going to share the 12 principles with you on the next slide. And I don't know if you've seen these before or not. If you haven't seen them, or for those of you who haven't seen them, I would like to issue a little warning before I put up that slide. Because it might look a bit overwhelming. And it is quite a mouthful, absolutely. But you don't have to do everything at the same time. And even more importantly, this is not a recipe. This is not about kind of ticking the boxes, do this, do this, do this. This is more an idea, it's more a philosophy. What it should mean in different companies depend on what kind of business you're in, what kind of culture you're coming from, what kind of history you have. And I think that's fine. I don't like recipes. You know, in recipes, the thinking is done. Somebody did the thinking for you. You are just supposed to implement. I think that's quite boring. I love ideas where you can kind of continue the thinking into and make it relevant for yourself. So, the 12 principles. You will recognize, again, that we talk about leadership and we talk about processes. On the leadership side, you will recognize a lot of the things I've talked about already being more values-based than rules-based, defining performance in a different way. Transparency is important, autonomy is important, as some examples. And on the process side, again, trying to move out of the fixed 29.2 performance contracts. Principle 8, there's a view on rewards, shared rewards. I will come back to that in a minute. Principle 9 and 10 addresses partly the rhythm in the process. Make it more continuous. Have a process that reflects the reality of business more than the reality of the calendar year. And then it is first on principle 11 that beyond budgeting starts to talk about cost, resources. And the only thing said here is that maybe there are smarter ways of managing cost than to sit in the autumn every year and hand out 1 million small bags of money. Because that is what the budgeting process is about. And you don't need to be a big company before we talk about millions of bags. And that handing out of these bags are then defining in the autumn the year before exactly what is the optimal level of spending for next year. But not just that, also what is the optimal split, right? So much for you and so much for you, so much on this and so much on that. How do we know that in the autumn the year before? If we at the same time agree that it is actually quite uncertain out there and we don't know what will pop up of threats and opportunities, right? So beyond budgeting is not about saying that cost is not important. Cost is just as important as before, but maybe there are more intelligent ways of managing them so that we can get more value for money. And I'll come back to alternatives later on to how you can do that. What you see here is an example of a coherent, consistent management model where we are trying to close the gaps between what is said and what is done. And let me illustrate that with a few examples of the opposite of those kind of gaps that you often see in companies. We just heard one example from SAS, but another example, it doesn't help if we in our companies talk about how fantastic people we have on board and how important people are for our success, and we would be nothing without you, and we would trust you so much, but not that much. Of course we need to manage you through those detailed budgets, because if not, I'm afraid that you will do a lot of stupid things. So we trust you, but not that much. Those kind of dual messages, those kind of gaps are poison in any organization. Because which message do you think is the strongest? What we say or what we do? Another example, it doesn't help if we in our town hall speeches or in our books or whatever talk loud and warm and sincere about we and us and together and team, if everything we do on the incentive side is geared around individual bonuses. Then there's one message on the leadership side, another message on the process side. Guess which one is strongest? So coherence, consistency is key here. Okay, that's what I wanted to say about beyond budgeting. We're going to zoom into Statoil, ambition to action. And our journey actually started out in a slightly different place. Because again, this is big stuff. And sometimes it can be kind of, you can scare some people if they are kind of cold on this and suddenly they see all of this. It can be a bit scary. So we were certainly aware of these principles, but we started out with a bit more tangible, in-the-face problem, more directly related to budgets. And it has to do with, we asked ourselves a question that we should ask ourselves often, namely the question of why. Why are we doing this? What is the purpose? And we asked that question to the budget. We asked ourselves, what is the purpose with those budget numbers that we spend an enormous amount of time on making every year? And I would like to raise the same question to you here. Why do you think companies are budgeting? What is the purpose of those budget numbers? Forget the text around those budget numbers. I'm thinking about that set of numbers. What's the purpose or purposes? Anyone?
Allocation of resources.
Allocation of resources, absolutely. It is a way of managing costs, right? By handing out those bags of money and making sure that we don't spend more. Absolutely. It's a valid purpose that we are trying to managing resources, right? Other purposes of a budget. Try to forecast what the future might look like. Right? Those budget numbers represent the forecast of what the future might look like in terms of cash flows and financial capacity and so on. Absolutely. We've got two purposes.
Keep control of what is going on in the organization.
Yeah, I agree with you. And the best way to do that is to make sure that you manage resources by giving people bags of money, right? If you don't get the bag, yeah. So I think it's kind of, I agree with you. I think it is covered by under that heading. But I'm after a third purpose, which lies in a slightly different category. Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, benchmarking is important, but I'm not sure if a budget kind of helps you to benchmark automatically. But we'll come back to benchmarking. It is a word it's a purpose that starts with a T. Target setting, absolutely. That is one purpose of budgets. We are using those budgets to set targets. Financial targets, production targets, sales targets, and so on, right? So here we have three different purposes, right? Target setting, forecasting, resource allocation. Spot on. And each of those are, in a way, sensible purposes. We need to do them in somehow. So that's not the problem. The problem lies when we combine these three purposes in one process that results in one set of numbers. That is when we are getting into deep shit. And let me explain you why that's the case. Let's assume that we are moving into a budget process. Let's assume that financial capacity is important for us, so we would like to understand financial capacity for next year. And in order to do that, you need to understand both the revenue side and the cost side. We start with the revenue side and we ask our salespeople, what is your best sales forecast for next year? Not on the last penny, but roughly your best sales forecast. But by the way, don't forget that the number that you now give me also will become your target for next year. And maybe there's a sales bonus attached to that target. So what was that sales forecast again? Could it be that potentially good sales forecast we were just about to get, it might start to move when the sales guy realized that, well, this is not just a forecasting discussion. This is also a target setting discussion. I'm negotiating my own pay. What might happen to that potentially good sales forecast? It might start to move. And which way? Down, right? We shouldn't blame the sales guy. We should blame our model because we are putting that guy in a difficult position, right? We ask for one thing, but actually we ask about two things. But we didn't quite understand that. We thought that sales forecast should be a bit higher, but we kind of moved on to the cost side and the investment side, CapEx side. So we asked the same people, other people, what is your best cost or investment forecast for next year? Not on the last penny, but roughly, because we need to understand financial capacity. But by the way, don't forget that the number you give me also become your budget for next year. And if you spend more, it has certain consequences. So what was that cost forecast again? It might start to move as well. And which way? Right? That is a problem in traditional budgeting. Another reason why this doesn't go together is that most companies would wish their teams to set somewhat ambitious targets with a certain level of stretch. Not overstretch, but with a certain level of stretch, right? Shouldn't be a plain walkover. So if high is good, good target could be here, right? Ambitious target. Do we want ambitious forecasts? Do we want ambitious forecasts?
Rather realistic forecast.
Absolutely. You want realistic forecasts. You want brutally honest forecasts, revealing what we think will happen, whether we like what we see or not. That's the difference between a target and a forecast. A target is what we want to happen. A forecast is what we think will happen. Two different things. Can't be in the same number. The solution to this problem is disappointingly simple, just like a lot of other stuff in our model. We still do all this stuff, but we do it in three separate processes. Right? We have a target setting process, we have a forecasting process, and a resource allocation process. And this can be different numbers and different things, different rhythm, different time horizons, because these are different things. And the beauty of separating is that that opens up a huge improvement agenda. Then we can start to have intelligent discussions around each one of these. For instance, on targets. Taking reality seriously, both the world out there and also people in the organization. How can we set targets that really motivate and inspire and drives all the good stuff we want? And kind of stretch us without feeling stretched, but without getting together with that all the gaming and the lowballing and the negotiations that we don't want. How can we find targets like that? I'm not saying it's easy, but it's much easier than if you're trying to have that discussion through a budget. On forecasts, how can we make forecasts which are a lean process and getting a rough idea of where we might be heading without all the negotiations and the gaming and the bias that you often see in forecasting. And last but not least, how can we find alternatives to this traditional detailed annual pre-allocation of resources? And how can we do all of this on a more event-based rhythm compared to a calendar-driven rhythm? So this is where we started out, but having those discussions kind of led us into those 12 principles and the bigger discussions, whether we wanted it or not. That is where kind of the separation leads you. So we took the 12 principles and formulated 5 principles in what we call ambition to action. And I'm going to share those principles with you now on ambition to action. The first one we've talked about already. That is about how we define performance. Right? Where possible, we are trying to define performance in a relative way, because at the end of the day, good performance is about how are we doing compared to those that we naturally can compare ourselves with. But defining performance is very simple. The million-dollar question is still, how do we get the best possible performance in our organizations? And again, we went back to taking reality seriously, and the conclusion is quite obvious, we think. We need to create bigger rooms to move in for teams in the organization so that they can respond fast when the unexpected is happening and there's no time to run 9 floors up. We want people to do the right thing when stuff happens. But this is not an anarchy where you can do whatever you want. There are still 4 solid walls in that bigger room to move. And the first wall is the Statoil book, starting with our values, leadership principles, people principles, and then the book says a little bit more about how we do things at Statoil, including what I'm talking about now. The second wall is ambition to action in itself, our version of the balanced scorecard, which I will come to in a minute. The third wall is something almost any company have. Decision criteria. When you're making an investment decision, it shall meet different, for instance, financial criteria of, could be net present value or payback or whatever. And also we have a set of decision authorities. How big individual decisions can managers make before they have to go one level up? Has nothing to do with budgets, right? But those decision authorities need to be generous enough so that people don't need to run 9 floors up for every decision. The last wall in this big room to move we have called sound business judgment. Never underestimate the power of sound business judgment in a knowledge organization. Then we are getting closer to budgets, because then we say that within this framework, resources are in principle available for people to do their job. That doesn't mean that you can spend whatever you want. There might be KPIs on your ambition to action that regulates costs, but in a more intelligent way than the traditional annual budget. There might, for instance, be a unit cost target, which means that you can spend more if you produce more, sell more if you You can spend more if you sell more, and so on, and vice versa. More self-regulating, as one example. If we are talking about new projects or activities, these still get a bag of money, and you might call that a budget. But the big difference is that we give those projects or activities the money when they need it. And that could be at any time during the year. It could be in January, in June, in December. Right? So what we don't have in Statoil anymore is an annual investment budget, where we sit in the autumn the year before and make all investment decisions. Let me explain this by leaving the big Statoil money. Let's think about our own money. Think about your money, your private finances. Does anybody here have plans about doing something expensive next year? So that you need to borrow money in your private bank? Wedding, wow. Wow. So you might need to borrow some money in your private bank, right? Yeah, maybe. Let's assume you need to borrow money. Let's also assume that, well, let's imagine that one day you got a letter from your bank saying that, very polite letter, saying, "Dear customer, we have now changed the opening hours in the bank. So if you want to borrow money, we are now only open in October, and the rest of the year we are closed." That might complicate your wedding, right? Yeah, possibly, right? You don't need to worry. You will never receive any letter like that from any bank. The bank have done some stupid things, but they are not that stupid, right? So no worries. And good luck with your wedding. Back to business. Those kind of letters I have been sending out as finance manager year after year. My letter was slightly different. It didn't start with "dear customer," it started with "dear colleague." If you want to spend money on something for next year, you better come and tell us now, because now it's budget time. And if it is something that you have forgotten, or more likely it wasn't on the radar screen for any of us, well, that's too bad. But it's so much easier for all of us if it's in the budget versus not being in the budget. We want the bank to be open 12 months a year, but you can still get a no on your loan application, on your funding request. We shall be just as good in saying no as yes. Cost is just as important as before. But when we say no, when we say yes, then we make decisions, right? And we want to make good decisions. And what do we need in order to make good decisions? Information, and preferably good information, right? And here's another question for you. At which point in time do we have the best information? Not just about the project that we shall say yes or no to, but also our capacity. Do we have the people? Do we have the money? Is that in the autumn the year before? Or is it as close as possible to project start? That's a leading question, isn't it? I hope we agree that you make better decisions the later you can make them. We call this dynamic resource allocation, and it is the part of beyond budgeting on the process side that people struggle the most with. This is more difficult than the annual pre-allocation, but it is much better. Fourth principle, we still have a business follow-up, even if we don't have budgets. But the typical budget follow-up is like this. It is about looking backwards and comparing the difference between actual year-to-date and budget year-to-date. And then you explain the variances. And trust me, if you are moving into companies that have budgets and you work within that area, you will spend a lot of time explaining budget variances. Used to be one of my core competences. I was pretty good on explaining budget variances. The problem with that is that doing that, we are looking backwards. And if this is backwards, then this is forwards. And this is where we want to move. So this is now where we have the key focus. We are going straight into that discussion of how does it look out there. Recall we separated target setting forecasting. Right? So the key discussion now is on how does it look out there, forecast versus target. If it looks okay, what kind of risks can jeopardize what looks okay today? So we are connecting risk management to this. If it doesn't look okay, what do we need to do to get back on track? Moving straight into that discussion. And last but not least, performance is not just a question of where we end up on the league table or what we deliver on business results. It is also a question of how. And how is defined by the values in this book and our behavior. And that decision to focus not just on what we deliver, but also on how we deliver, that came from our CEO. he made that decision, and in order to make sure that everybody understood that he was serious about this, he put the weighting between the two, delivery and behavior, he put the weighting to 50-50. And I would argue that, isn't that only obvious? Because how can we claim to be a values-based company if values are completely absent when it comes to targets and performance evaluation, right? So it came from our CEO. He looks like this. His name is Helge Lund, and this is a few things he has said about ambition to action lately. So take a quick look at that before we move on. What he's talking about is exactly the two same triggers as I talked about. The world out there, people in the organization. He is a wise man, and here is another wise man on the next slide. That is our CFO. And what you now will see is stuff that he said only a few months ago, because we are preparing ourselves for what might be tough times ahead. We don't know, but we don't think this is over. So we need to be prepared also on the cost side, but we don't want to launch the big traditional cost program or kind of cutting 10% across the board and all that stuff. So we want to do it in a different way, and this is what our CFO said a couple of months ago. Okay. With those quotes, let's be a bit more specific. Let's zoom into this ambition to action process that I've been kind of hinting at and be a bit more specific. Ambition to action, which is our version of the balanced scorecard, has three purposes. It is the traditional, you've been teaching balanced scorecards?
Yes.
Okay, so you're familiar with the concept of balanced scorecards, right? Then you would know that the key purpose you often hear is it is a way of translating strategy, so to help you execute your strategies, right? We have that as a purpose as well, but we have two more. The second purpose is about securing that flexibility I talked about, the room to act and perform. And the third purpose is to activate, again, what we say in this book about values and people and leadership principles. Then there are some steps in this process which you will recognize from a balanced scorecard process. We translate strategies into strategic objectives. What does success look like on a medium-term time horizon? Where are we going? Then we are trying to find KPIs that can measure that we are moving in this direction. Nothing unique as such. But don't forget that nothing happens just because we measure. You don't lose weight simply by weighing yourself. I've tried several times. No big success. Nothing happens before we do something, and that is why we have a big focus on actions in this model and trying to understand consequences of actions through forecasts, right? And then finally, we have a translation of all of this into individual team goals, and here you recognize delivery and behavior. So all 20,000 employees have either individual goals or team goals. And everybody would have something said around behavior. But again, the bad news here is that this as such is not very unique, because this is based on the balanced scorecard concept, and all our competitors have balanced scorecards in some form or shape. So if we shall get competitive advantage out of this, we have to do it in an even better way. And I would like to share with you a few examples of where we are trying to be different. One example has to do with KPIs, and specifically with the I in KPI, which stands for indicator, right? These are indicators. They're trying to indicate that we are moving towards our strategic objectives. I've been working with balanced scorecards since 1995. Borealis was one of the first companies in Europe that implemented balanced scorecards. I was so fascinated with this concept when it came, especially these KPIs that would come and tell us everything we hadn't understood about that type of business. Expectations up here, reality down here. It wasn't that easy to find these fantastic KPIs. But I'm quite a stubborn person, and my hunt for the perfect KPI continued for many years afterwards. But now I've given up. Simply because the perfect KPI does not exist. There are good KPIs, there are a combination of KPIs that can make them better, but the KPIs need help in the job we are giving them, or being a place where we express kind of what we want to happen, targets and so on, and being also a place where we evaluate performance. We need a broader, richer language than just the measurement. There has to be something on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side, and also we need this holistic performance evaluation, which I will come back to, where we take off the measurement glasses and look at the stuff that measurement is not able to pick up. Right? Has there been changes in assumptions, tailwind, headwind? How sustainable is what you have done? How ambitious were your targets? A lot of things you know more about afterwards, but not necessarily when that target was set. Albert Einstein, he once said something wise here. He said that not everything, so don't misunderstand me, measurement is still an important part of the model, but measurement is a good servant, it's not a good master. We need to be the master, and measurement should be the servant. That is one difference, because with a number of our competitors, the scorecard seems to be mainly focused on KPIs, and that is a problem. It used to be like that in Statoil also, but we've done something with it. Another area where we are trying to be different is how we kind of try to make things hang together. I'll come to that in a minute. I just wanted to share with you an example of such an ambition to action. This is actually a screenshot from, forget the content, I guess you can't read it in any case, but this is actually Statoil's ambition to action, quite a recent version. And you will recognize the perspectives that you typically find in the balanced scorecard. We've added on health, safety, and the environment, HSE, because it's very important. But then you recognize the three elements that I just talked about. Where are we going? How do we get there? And how do we measure progress? By the way, in most other companies, the order would be the opposite, right? When you've been reading about balanced scorecards, finance would always sit on top, right? And learning and growth, some people call it, would sit at bottom. We call it people and organization. It used to be like that in Statoil as well. What do you think happened when we had business review meetings and the agenda was a bit tight? No time to talk about people and organization this time either. We'll come back to it next week, right? Or next week. What kind of message are we sending to the organization about the importance of people and organization? So we switched the order. People and organization sits on top. That's where we start. And believe me, there's always time to talk about finance. Today we have around 1,200 of these in the company. And the one on top here, the Statoil ambition to action, is the only thing our board approved. They do not approve a budget. In the same board meeting, they see some other numbers of what the financial future might look like in terms of forecast and so on, but they don't approve those forecasts. They take note of them. If that board meeting had been 3 weeks later, those numbers would have looked different. What they approve is ambition to action. Then a lot of people ask, out in the line here, should we have an ambition to action in our team? What's the corporate instruction? Doesn't exist. When we get that question, we tell people that we would certainly recommend this, but your main motivation for using an ambition to action in your team should be that this is something that is perceived as meaningful, relevant, that helps you to perform, helps you to manage yourself. That has to be the main motivation. If the main motivation is the opposite, namely that somebody far up here have told you that you shall have an ambition to action so that I can cascade and instruct a lot of stuff down to you, that you should report back up to me. In our organization, if your own ambition to action only becomes a landing ground for instructions from above, in our culture, the first thing that happens is that the ownership walks out the door. Right? Well, this is not my ambition to action. It's all been kind of instructed on me. And if ownership walks out the door, quality tends to follow. You seldom get the same quality in something that you mainly do for others compared to if you mainly do it for yourself. But still, we need this to be aligned, right? It can't be anarchy with kind of things pointing in all kind of directions. The way we create alignment from corporate and all the way out is not in the traditional way of cascading. We don't use that word, we use a different word and a different process. And the different word and the different process is translation instead of cascading. Cascading is about this unit instructing this unit. Translation is about switching the roles. Then this unit is in the driver's seat. What should our ambition to action look like in order to support the ambition level and strategic direction of this ambition to action, and maybe if I'm looking one further up, this one, and so on. What kind of strategic objectives do we need? What kind of KPIs do we need? What kind of targets do we need? What kind of actions do we need? That translation should take hours in any management team. It creates a common understanding, it creates commitment, and all the good stuff we want. And of course, if that translation should point in the wrong direction, which very seldom happens, by the way, then of course the level above, the team above, should intervene and do what they are paid for. But it's not a problem. In doing that translation, you need to not just look to the next ambition to action. Maybe you need to look all the way up to corporate. Maybe you need to look over here, to be inspired, or where there are coordination issues. We support that by having full transparency. All of these ambition to actions are open for everybody.
Other business units that don't do it? I mean, can't they say don't this way?
If a business area on top here, level 2, had said that we don't want to use an ambition to action, I think there would have been a discussion. But it's not been an issue. But you have many teams out there. Some try it out and continue, some try it out and don't continue, and that's fine. We don't know where the right level to stop is and who should go deep, and so this is, but the number of ambition to actions keep increasing all the time. It's all about creating this ownership. It's so important. But transparency, everything is open. With a few, there might be a few share sensitive things that we need to close. That is closed. Okay, I'm getting towards the end here. Holistic performance evaluation. Holistic here means two things. First, not just looking at delivery, but also at behavior, and the two counting 50-50. We talked about that. The second part of holistic has to do with delivery, and it has to do not with blindly reading the meter, the KPIs. We do that, but then we take off the measurement glasses and ask some sensible questions to pressure test that measurement. Have you really moved towards those strategic objectives? How ambitious were those targets? Who were gaming, who were not gaming? Those kind of things very often become visible afterwards than up front. Has there been changes in assumptions, tailwind, headwind, of such a magnitude that we should take it into account? Was there a competitor going bankrupt, so delivery became a piece of cake? Or was there an earthquake in Japan that made things a bit more difficult? Some of those things maybe should be taken into account. Managers need to know that there is fairness in this process. It is more difficult. Nothing is easier to say 29.2 is the target, end of story. But we don't think that's good enough in this kind of world. And when those evaluations have been done, we can have a view on what kind of performance are we looking at, and that evaluation is the basis for the development plan for all employees, which is the main purpose of that evaluation. But another purpose is rewards, mainly base salary adjustments, but we do have some individual bonuses, and they will also be regulated by the same system, going through that holistic evaluation. Okay, let me close off with the latest step on this journey. Kicking out the calendar. We often start with this story about the finance guy who met a fisherman. And don't ask me how that happened, but let's assume it happened. And then the finance guy asked the fisherman, tell me a little bit about your life and your working life and the rhythm of your working life. Well, says the fisherman, first I'm at sea for 5 months, and then I'm home for 5 months. The finance guy becomes very silent, and you can see that he is thinking very hard before his next question is coming. What are you then doing the 2 last months? What are you then doing the 2 last months? Because something is wrong here, right? 5 plus 5 is only 10. It doesn't add up, it's not 12, January to December. Something is wrong. And something is wrong, but maybe not in the working rhythm of the fisherman, but maybe in the head of the finance guy. As I said earlier, from a business point of view, January to December can very often be an artificial period. I used to work for some years as finance manager for our oil trading business. And anything beyond 3 weeks is quite foggy for those guys. But for other people at Statoil who work with what we call field development, taking discoveries we make and to get them into production, For them, 3 years is on the short side. Why should we force everybody into the same rhythm, same time horizon, same frequencies? So what we now have done is that there used to be annual versions of ambition to action. Right? The 1200, they used to be set for 2009, they used to be set for 2010. That's history. The ambition to action that these teams now have is not the ambition to action for 2011. It is the ambition to action that they have until they have another one. And change, you can change whatever you want on your ambition to action when there is a need for changing it. We want this to be event-driven instead of calendar-driven. You can change your objectives when strategy change. You can change your KPIs when objectives change, or if you find better KPIs, which happens. You can even change your targets if those targets have lost their meaning. And lost their meaning could mean two things. Either impossible to achieve. They have become, for different reasons, impossible to achieve. Everybody laughs about them. They have lost their meaning. Or the opposite, a piece of cake. Something happened that kind of this was, a piece of cake. Or simply they are not relevant anymore for other reasons. Some people have asked us to define what is an event. And the only definition we can come up with is whatever is big enough for you in your business reality. You need to define that. We can't define that from corporate level. Now you might say, well, this is anarchy, because here you can change whatever you want. But it's not that simple. We have a very simple control mechanism around this. We have said that if you want to make a big change, you still need to seek approval where you normally do that, but you can do it at any time. If you want to make a small change, you simply inform to the same level. Big or small, always inform others which are affected by your changes. This is the coordination part of it. Why should all coordination be a kind of corporate responsibility? We want more of it to take place this way. Then again, some people have asked, what is big and what is small here? Well, we can't define that. That is something that any team needs to define in the relationship with the team above and with teams below if they have teams reporting to them. And if someone ends up with a definition of big and small over here, which is different from someone over here, that's okay, as long as it works both places. Again, we want to make this an even more self-regulating process. We want to get out of the way as kind of corporate finance and let this kind of regulate this as much as possible itself. If this trust is misused, of course we will intervene. But when that happens, and it will happen, we will not put everybody in jail. We will deal with that incident and continue with the rest. Time horizons. We want varying time horizons, both on targets and forecasts. On forecast, a number of companies have implemented 5-quarter rolling forecasts. We did that in Borealis as well. That means that you update your quarter forecast every quarter and you look 5 quarters ahead. And that's fine, much better than traditional forecasting against the wall of end of December. We were about to do the same, but then it struck us that in a way it is just another version of the calendar in the sense that it is a fixed frequency and a fixed time horizon for everybody across businesses. So we said, no, we would like something even more business tailored. So we call this dynamic forecasting. You should update your forecast when something happens, event-driven, and as far ahead as is relevant for your business. For some it might mean 3 weeks, for others 3 years, for others 6 years, right? It depends. And the fact that we on corporate level always need to look 10 years ahead shouldn't mean that we should force every local team to look 10 years ahead. That's rather than add on some kind of generic forecasts a bit higher up in the organization, which is what we do. Targets as well. Why should all targets have an end of December deadline? I mean, some targets should be shorter. There's urgency. We need to deliver in 4 months, put 4 months. If it's more complex and we need 15 months, put 15 months. And by all means, if end of December is okay, fits as a deadline, people can do that. We haven't banned the calendar year. We just opened up for other possibilities. And last but not least, in our people at Statoil process, our HR process, where performance is evaluated, we do the holistic performance evaluation. That will still, for the time being, take place on an annual cycle. But then some would look back on a very dynamic ambition to action, others on an ambition to action where not much has happened. But some of our HR people have started to ask the question they should ask. Why is it so that all performance evaluations always should take place once a year in February? Is it just because that then we are adjusting the pay? Well, if that's the only reason, maybe it isn't a good enough reason. If the main purpose of this is development and not pay. The interesting thing with taking this step is that people were much more concerned in Statoil in 2005 when we kicked out the budget, even if a number of companies had done that before us at that time. When it comes to this step, people are quite relaxed, even if we have a lot of questions about how this is going to work. Still, we have been looking for other companies that have done something similar. I'm sure they exist, but we haven't found them. So this is really a big step into the unknown. People are very enthusiastic about kind of that experimenting that we now are introducing, kind of how often, how far out, and so on. But they would rather be part of finding out instead of being told. And if this shouldn't work, and the risk around it, if it shouldn't work, so what? We just go back to the calendar year overnight. The risk is zero compared to the upside potential. I'm saying when this is working and not if it's working, because I'm convinced it's going to work. Okay, so summing up, what we are doing is to try to move towards a more self-regulating management model, addressing a lot of the things that I've talked about. What you see here is a lot of the stuff I've talked about today, and it's all about giving ambition to action back to the line, something that can help themselves to help them to perform to their full potential. Right, that is what I wanted to share with you. I know we'll have a discussion afterwards now, but if someone should have questions that is not coming up, feel free to contact me on these coordinates. If you're even more interested, this is the website for the roundtable. We have our next meeting in London in May. If somebody wants to come along just to have a look on what this is, you're more than welcome. And if you're even more interested, what you just have heard is the short version of the Statoil story, and this is the long version. It's a book I wrote a couple of years ago, which is not just about the Statoil case, but also about the Borealis case, and more about the problems and more about the implementation. Right. That's all I have to share with you. Thank you. Yeah, by all means. Well, you guys simply tired. Yeah, by all means. It can be. There are no secrets. Yeah. So.
Maybe I have two questions. The first one will be: this model seems to be very, very successful for private sector when you are in a VUCA world all the time. But what about the public sector, where you can really more when the year is much more predictable and the projects are more predictable? And the second one would be: what about the new countries, the BRIC countries? Isn't it that easier to apply in Western Europe and US? And what about the new emerging countries?
The first question, I think that the majority of these principles are also applicable for the public sector. For instance, the holistic performance evaluation. Why shouldn't you have that in the public sector also as you have it here? Or more local free, even if there is a kind of a total budget given at the beginning of the year. You don't need to kind of turn around and hand out all of those money immediately at the beginning of the year. Make it more, make the bank for projects open or 12 months a year instead of only in October the year before, and some other stuff. So it's easier in the private sector, but you can do it in the. When it comes to cultures, I get that question a lot. I think this is, of course there are cultural differences. I think we sometimes overestimate those differences. And we meet them because we are operating globally. I just shared with Johan a story about a Brazilian company called Semco. Has anybody heard about Semco? Right, it's fantastic. I mean, it's a Brazilian company which has gone much further than we have dared to think about when it comes to how they lead and manage. They have turned every traditional truth about management upside down. They are doing fantastic. And this is in Brazil, right? So take a look at the book called Maverick, written by the CEO 25 years ago. Fantastic, fantastic book. Okay.